I want to just introduce you to our next keynote. We're going to move from Africa across to Latin America just before lunch and then fly back to Latin America after lunch again. But when I was preparing the conference program, I was speaking to a number of Brazilians. They said, you've got to get Chico. You've got to get Chico. And I was going, who's Chico? They said, Francisco Brito Cruz. Now, Francisco is one of the most knowledgeable people about the Brazilian legislative situation. He heads up the Internet Lab in Brazil, and we're really, really honored to have him with us today. Over to you.
Hello. Are you listening to me? So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael, the organizers, the supporters of this event. So happy being here. My name is Chico Francisco. I am director of Internet Lab. We're a Brazilian think tank. You can also call me your last obstacle before lunch. So I will do a quick overview here about the Brazilian scenario. Then I will present two groups of questions departing from it. And then I will share some learnings that I have and wanting to know if they are relatable with yours. So I have three premises just before that. First, policies for sustaining public interest journalists are key for democracies, as Michael said. Two, there's no such thing as a global discussion if you are talking about country-level policy conversations in rich countries. These so-called global conversations are actually minority world conversations. And the last one is that my perspective is from a policy-oriented observer, not from a media stakeholder. I will also talk here about tactics, so I hope to hear if this is relatable for you or not. So our context. Brazilian context is legislative, the fake news bill. This is happening since 2020. I am not keep talking here about many phases of the bill, but it's important to say that it's a bandwagon bill. You can call it DSA with lasers, or you can also call it a packing of the Australian code with the DSA. I have a summary deck for that. If you want to know more about the other parts of the Brazilian bill, just ask me, I can send you that. It's around 2021 when the media sustainability part entered the bill. And this will be the center of my presentation here. So just a summary, which are the moving forces of this bill? This does not come from the Lula government. The moving forces of this bill are, first, an heterodox and interventionist behavior from our Supreme Court against Bolsonaro, our former president. And this is clearly abusing its functions and its limits, although their functions are necessary for protecting our democracy. I know it's complicated. And two, legacy media agreements with the Congress leadership. And of course, this is not publicly known entirely, but I'm talking about global, so the main corporate legacy media there, frenzy to hinder its competitors while it's making its transition to digital, especially to streaming service. And yes, this is also complicated, right? But the support for the remuneration is different from those moving forces because first, of course, legacy media refused settling with Google, but this was seconded by digital natives, journalist unions, and some civil society, and also the Lula government. But this is not the designing force. The designing force is different. The designing force is more distributed around civil society, around some other stakeholders. So what are the opposition force? Of course, big tech, as you know, but conservative and far-right politicians, and also some civil society reluctants, as I like to call them. And I'm not be surprised if you imagine that especially the big tech lobby resulted in at least some ethical problems and possibly some unlawful activities in terms of abuse of power. What are the results until now? We don't have a bill approved, so what are the results? I would say that the discussion was a little bit frustrating and arid for those who try to do some advocacy, but some entry points for AJOR, our Digital Native Association, represented here by Maya, and others could enter a little bit on the debate, and especially when the government decided, Lula's government, so this year, decided to help them. And so the results, one, the news bargaining part was built with much less detail than Canada and Australia. It's not a code. Most versions recognize just the right, so it's one article. And the last one has a little bit more detail, but has not more than 2 pages. 2, no data, no deep data was involved in the public conversation, and this is super frustrating. 3, we don't have a good operational and contextual definitions and standards. We really don't. 4, very little transparency measures were accepted on the text. And last, my feeling here is that our lessons have more to do with the political process than have to do with actual solutions. So due to the lack of process, structure, and concerned leadership towards public interest, we don't have good solutions to offer you. So, learnings. So these are some questions that I had during the process around windows of opportunity and ways of doing. First, which legislation we should bat? A full platform regulation framework or only media sustainability framework? This is the question that many people did on the beginning of this discussion. Is this the project or not? We should bundle with the DSA-like project or not? Second, so the answers for that were, one agenda should help each other, so yes. But on the other side, this agenda could reframe part of the political spectrum and then being an obstacle for approving something. So the second question, should we take advantage on this window of opportunity created by legacy media or not? So the reflection was, we should do that on a project that mainly was endorsed or created by a breach pressured by global or the legacy media. The answer yes would say, yes, this would help to create climate and open doors. But the answer no would say, legacy media in context like Latin America should not be trusted. They could enhance problems to democracy. This is to say, something like, this is not like Australia because there is no institutional framework or regulatory framework previously built to pull others into this discussion. So the question was, if global enters, the others will enter as they would enter that. 3, everything should be detailed on the law, or we just need to recognize this right. So we should trust the executive or we should trust the legislative. So many people said, if Lula administration issued the Delegate Act to detail that, this should work. And others would say, no, if Lula issued the Delegate Act, this shouldn't work. And last, who's going to be the regulator? We have some PEP dependency on that. And in my opinion, this has to do with the thing that until 2020, I would say, a regulation about media was always understood as a signal of authoritarianism. And of course, this has to do with our context, with our background. But also, this was a tool by legacy media until 2020 to block regulation around them. So these are some questions. And then I will jump to learnings about adversaries and allies. I will list some here and then wanting to have a conversation on lunch about them. So the first allies on that, of course, digital natives, independent media, unions of journalism. Okay. But 2, legacy media, we should approach them. How should we approach them, as I already told you. But are others that I think are also important for us to have a conversation. First, how to deal with barely news organizations or junk news organizations that have already shifted or customized its business models to adhere on platforms, formats, and revenue stream. So I'm talking about hyper-partisans. I'm talking about influencers. So the first channel of information that published a post around the Ukraine invasion on the beginning of last year was not a newspaper, was an Instagram page that posts celebrity gossip. So this was the first channel that published this information in Brazil. And these guys are huge. They are audience juggernauts. And how we should behave around them. And many of them argue that regulation would shrink their cake or should only privilege mainstream media. So how is our relationship with those actors? And of course, I think there is also a conversation around dividing this camp, because this camp is not, I would say, convergent. Like we saw some very important influencers endorsing this kind of bill in Brazil. Other stakeholders that I think it is worth the conversation: artists and creators. So Lula's government decided to bundle with the news remuneration part a remuneration for actors, musicians that have ancillary rights in the internet that have to be paid. This helps or this does not help? In our case, I would say it helped to gain a little bit more traction, but on the other side, it's complicated. You gain more enemies, of course. And I have more too, adversaries or allies. One is the digital rights field, so my field. This field, or we are the open internet dogmatics, or we are the human rights quality control, how we should be seen. And the last one is a progressive government. They seemed allies at first, but it was this government that decided to complicate more the discussion, bringing the artist's remuneration part and even working to protect hyper-partisan media. So, some words to end about the path forward. Being carried by others is not comfortable or even effective, but taking advantage on windows of opportunity is, the way for finding political space. So we need to learn how to do that. The second one is that I never seen a fully independent regulator in my country or region. And my reflection here is what to do about that. This is a whatever, or this is a never mind. The third one is that we need good data. We need good research. And this is important to know what to demand. The fourth one is that we need good models to adapt on our context. And this has something to do with our homework around path dependency, for example. We should build a regulator, or we should look at non-obvious regulators for take advantage of. And of course, we need to see the long-term perspective. What if we approve a bill, we give the executive many powers for regulating, and in 2026, the next presidential election, Bolsonaro or a Bolsonaro ally wins the election and puts the country again in the path to autocracy? How we should deal with that? So these are my questions. I hope you have a really nice lunch. And if you guys wanting to receive the deck around the other details of the bill, or even have conversation about that, happy to do it.
We can hold on the food. I think just I'm sure some people want a few questions. So just let's take a few minutes, and just in case anyone's got any questions. Patricia and then Nick. That's a frequent. Okay. Sorry.
This is a bit unfair. It's going to be a question by a Brazilian to a Brazilian, but just thinking, my name is Patricia. I am a journalist. Just the last sentence that you left us with. What happens if we have legislation and next president is an autocratic? And I think this could be useful for everyone here. What happens if we don't have legislation and the next president is an autocratic president? Because in the previous autocratic president, he tried to enact executive order, several other places. And as it is now, we have the Supreme Court basically legislating. So in terms of having a vacuum of legislation, isn't that more dangerous than having a regulation that is not perfect, but at least was democratically discussed in Congress?
Can I respond quickly? My response is, what is more dangerous? Being attacked by a shark or by a crocodile? I really don't know. I think we should avoid both. So I think we should approve a legislation. We should endorse this discussion and this legislation. But when we are building this legislation, we should build the protections to the future that we don't know of. So,
Nick from Weber Wenzel. So, just using our knowledge of how society works, how economies work, those social, political, economic realities, how practically can you effect change, what we are wanting here, without the support of big institutions like legacy media? So just what are those practical steps? If you're a small independent publisher, how do you actually get a great result out of this without that support or support from someone else?
I obviously don't have the perfect answer for that, but I think that the role of the government in Brazil now could balance the power of legacy media in this discussion, for example. The problem on that, in my opinion, was the noise created by the issue around artists' remuneration, and also the issue around the relationship of the government with hyper-partisan media. But I think it would be the role of government also to balance a little bit, because, of course, when you have only one big power to relate with, you're always in disadvantage. But when you gain with more than one power, I think you can find some breaches. But of course, this is a conversation about tactics. This is a conversation about what is more politically convenient or not.
Hi, it's Gwetlane Pamudi. I work in development and democracy building. I'm really interested in this I'd like to say false dichotomy that you put to us, around can we have an independent enough regulator, and do we want to be, regulator or swim with a shark versus swimming with a crocodile? It strikes me, and I think that the point was raised earlier this morning, it strikes me that, one, it's a false dichotomy because we ultimately do need public power in order to be able to govern the space and support the weaker parties, in order to be able to, engage and balance the power with these big tech platforms, as one example, right? The second also is, what happens when we don't, how are we thinking about the regulator and the regulatory interventions when we're saying, well, actually, let's not try to focus too much on trying to get the perfect, getting this regulator in place, when we actually should be because of the independence issues, when the issue really isn't so much about the regulator per se, but the democratic institutions around the regulator and the work that we actually do need to be doing around strengthening those democratic institutions so that regulator can, get the best shot at independence as it can. And so perhaps the question to you is, if we, try to probe a little bit further and say, well, what could a good enough regulator look like? What would you maybe propose in that regard? You know, what kinds of key features are required so that the target can be at, you know, getting good enough regulation as opposed to no regulation or regulator at all? Thank you.
So I think I have doubts if a regulator for the news media bargaining part should be the same regulator for social media platforms in terms of content moderation. I don't know. But in terms of, if it was the same, I would say at least we would need to build some traditional independence rules, such as if the chair or the committee should have a term and not be able to be fired by any reason. We should have at least some participation of media peers and some kind of social control / participation. I think some Congress oversight together with the executive oversight, I think would be also good, because we could enhance some minority powers. But I mean, we're discussing this regulator there, and the problem until now was that the government is not strong enough to put a proposal on the table, because the Congress doesn't want Lula to have the powers for regulating social media. The Congress wants these powers for itself. So I think the discussion it's on baby steps yet, unfortunately.
So, Francisco, my name is Courtney Raj. You raised a really critical point, which is that a lot of the, digital rights community, especially the global community that you and I are both part of, seems to be very against this type of legislation. The warnings that many groups submitted to Australia about a link tax, and this would break the internet. We've seen a lot of opposition to the Journalist Conservation Preservation Act in the US. The same idea that it seems like, they're saying, well, if it can't be perfect, we shouldn't have it at all. What is your advice for trying to lessen the divide between the media, people in this room, for example, and the digital rights groups who have this dominant position in a lot of the conversations, including with the tech platforms and with a lot of the regulators? Like, how do we either get rid of that opposition or at least make them less vocal? How do we close that divide?
Courtney, I think we should found a club called the Digital Rights Pro Media Sustainability, but just kidding. I think that one thing that is working now in Brazil is try to make a bridge among digital rights and public interest media advocates that are not legacy media. So I think Ajor is making a huge work during Natalia's term as chairman, and also like some unions of journalists are making this effort. And of course, digital rights organizations need to be open for this. And we need to bring, for example, Ajor or, for example, other media associations to our events, to hear them, to know about them. Because it's not about global, it's not about Murdoch. It's about much more than that, right? So I think that it depends on the stakeholder you're having a conversation with within the ecosystem.
Chico, sorry.
I really am going to have to call Natalia. Do you want to go, or can you wait till after lunch?
Last one, or at least, sorry, from Brazil as well. So, Chico, I find that in Brazil there were two issues that created more confusion on the debate and were abused by the platforms to muddy the waters a lot. First one is the lack of technical knowledge of the legislators. And the second one, the fact that in Brazil, we have never had a serious conversation about the relevance of the media. There is no conversation about media self-regulation or anything like it. We don't even have media criticism in Brazil. I wonder if there's lessons learned about that, and if there's things that you think we Brazilians should have done ahead of jumping into legislating.
many things, and this is what I was saying about not doing the previous homework and wanting to make the exam without studying. I think that legacy media is also responsible for this in our country, but I think that it's tough not having this homework done. But like we cannot take this as the reason for not doing, right? And I empathize with you when we see big tech taking advantage of those issues that our country have to make more confusion around it. And I think that our experience, for example, with Google it's been very, very different than the experience that some others related here. And yeah.
Okay, we are about 15 minutes behind, which is not bad, I suppose. But I do think that we need to get to lunch, which is very, very high on everyone's agenda, I'm sure. We're supposed to be back at 1:30? No, 1:30. I'll tell you what, let's still be back at 1:30.